Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director, and with us after a couple-week hiatus is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, we are happy to have you back. Welcome. I'm doing wonderful, especially having you back in the United States here. It's been a great joy. Or not in the United States, but in the contiguous continental United States. You recently took a trip out to Hawaii. Now, it wasn't a vacation. You were there for some talks. So tell us about that.
Oh, it was a great trip. I was invited by Bishop Larry Silva, who's the Bishop of Honolulu, and he's the Bishop of all of Hawaii, and to give the Red Mass homily. Now, the Red Mass, the listeners might know, is a Mass that celebrates and prays for lawyers, judges, politicians. So it's kind of at the beginning of the judicial year, you know. So I was invited to do that. But then while I was there, I also gave a couple of talks and a sermon and said Mass, and had a chance to visit Molokai, the great site of St. Damien and St. Marianne Cope. You know, so two heroes of the faith who, in the fullest possible sense, gave their whole lives to service. We flew from Honolulu in a little puddle jumper, about a 35-minute flight over to Molokai. And you land on this little tiny airstrip. I thought, this guy's only got one shot at landing this plane. You know, if he's a little over, we're right in the ocean. So we landed there and got a great tour of this little section of Molokai. It's like a little tongue that sticks out north of the island. And that was considered about the most isolated and kind of secluded place they could find to send people in the beginning of the mid-19th century who were suffering from leprosy. And the idea was there they'd be so sequestered they wouldn't infect the rest of the islands, you know. So there was something, kind of awful, not quite cruel is not the right word, because people were probably doing the best they could at the time, but something awful about it. The people were basically sent to this prison for life, you know. But then to take someone like Damien, who arrives on a voluntary basis and says, I will stay here with you as your priest. And he stayed for 16 years until he himself died. And he had developed leprosy by the end of his life, was suffering from it terribly, and died pretty young, about 49, I think he was when he died. But he and St. Marianne Cope came to that place and knew basically they'd never leave. And they gave their whole lives to it.
How about the other experience you had there? Not only did you get to visit St. Damien, his tomb where his body used to be at least, and then the other sites, but you also got to visit Pearl Harbor. Tell us what that was like.
Oh, yeah. The last day I was there, so we had one day of kind of pure just downtime. And we were accompanied by a wonderful retired Navy chaplain, a priest from Nashville. And he's stationed out there now, and he's a full captain, so he opened every door for us. And we got a tour. I'd never been to Hawaii before, so to see the Arizona, and you can really see it, you know, the great ship that went down on December 7th, 1941, and all the sailors who died on that ship are still there. They're buried in the ship. So it's very moving. And the chaplain pointed out to us, if you lean over, you can see little bubbles coming to the surface. And then a bit of an oil slick on the top. He said, you know what that is? And I said, no. He said, it's oil still coming out of the Arizona. Isn't that amazing? After 75 years, he said that the ship is still, as it were, alive, you know. So we saw that. And then also right behind it now, they have permanently moored is the battleship Missouri, on which the final surrender documents were signed by General MacArthur and his colleagues, you know. So that was a wonderful experience just to see that ship. So that was very moving. That was the final day. I also gave a talk at St. Teresa's Co-Cathedral, which is a big church in the heart of Honolulu. And what a church that is there. I mean, it's Hawaii, as Bishop Silva said to us, is further from anywhere else than any place else on earth. That's how he put it. It's like you're just, as you look north on Oahu, next stop, the Aleutian Islands. You look south, like from Pearl Harbor, look south, next stop, Antarctica. Look west, next stop, China. Look east, next stop, Mexico. And so it's in the middle of nowhere, you know. And to this little archipelago have come people from all over Asia. So Filipinos and Koreans and Japanese and Chinese, and so it's an extraordinary experience and a great vibrant church.
Well, in this episode, we'd like to turn our attention to a prominent theological question that comes up not just in the halls of the academies, but among every Christian and non-Christian. Here's the question: how are we saved? You know, we're here in 2017, roughly 500 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation, and this topic of salvation remains a contentious one. So let's start off with this simple question, Bishop. If someone came up to you on the street and said, "Are you saved?" how would you respond?
The Lord and I are working on
it. Good.
You know what I mean? It's because, see, for Catholics, it's a complicated thing, as you know, Brandon, and it's the falling and rising point of the Reformation. Maybe go back to the meaning of the word, soteria in Greek, salvatio in Latin. It means healing. Healing. Christ is the salvator. He bears the salus to us. It means health. I always remind people that the word salvation is very closely related to our word salve in English, S-A-L-V-E, right? Because it's like a healing balm, a salve. Christ is the savior. He's the one that brings the healing. Now, how's that happen? Remember the church fathers said, Deus fit homo and homo fieret Deus. God became human, that human beings might become God. And what they meant by that was, God entered fully into our humanity that he might divinize our humanity. He might heal us from what's wrong in us and then raise us up to a full participation in his life. I would say salvation is the whole process by which we are brought to divinization. It's the whole healing process by which we're brought from sin and alienation all the way to intimate union with God in Christ, if that makes sense. So the question of, are you saved, as though it's this moment that I can identify. No, I'm being saved. See, might be a Catholic answer. I'm being drawn ever more deeply into full communion with God in Christ. My sins are being healed. My life is being restored. So we tend to take a more process view, if you want, of salvation, rather than a once and for all. On this date, I was saved. Now, one way Catholics play this game, and I get it too, is when a Protestant asks for that, hey, when did it happen? You could name the day of your baptism. Okay, that makes sense to me. It means the day you were grafted onto Jesus Christ. But see, we would tend to see that more as a beginning rather than an end. That's the day that the process began, of divinization. So that's a quick way for Catholics maybe to get at that issue.
Anytime we talk about getting saved or being saved or the process of salvation, it automatically implies a precursor question, which is saved from what? What are we being saved from, Bishop? Sin.
And sin is a state of alienation. Now, pick your metaphor, because the Bible uses different metaphors. So if salvation means health, sin is a kind of sickness, right? The sin-sick soul. I've always liked that phrase from the hymn, St. Augustine says, we've wandered into the region of unlikeness, of dissimilitudo, he says. Well, see, we're meant to be in similitudo with God. We're meant to be in the land of likeness unto God. Sin is a wandering away. Think of the prodigal son, or think of Adam and Eve who've left the garden and have gone into the desert. So we're saved from the desert. We're brought back online. We're saved from sickness, a sin-sick soul. Another way to play with it, use the word that Paul used and that Luther was very interested in, namely justification. Dikaiosune in Paul's Greek. And Paul knew the legal forensic culture of his time, and he's borrowing the term from there. But also as a Jew, he knew all about legal righteousness, right? Well, what's justification but being set right? Think of something that's offline, it's off plane, it's not on target. And to be justified is to be rectified, we might say, set right again. So there I'm being saved from this state of being off kilter, I've lost justice. Now, what's justitia? Now go back to the Council of Trent. Justitia is right relationship with God. Friendship with God, if you want. So I'm being saved from injustice. I'm off kilter. Now, see, what I'm doing here, you probably recognize, is typically Catholic thing, is I'm taking a lot of different images of sickness, of legal, injustice, of geographic distance. I'm taking a lot of different images and then applying the terminology. Christ rectifies me. Christ saves me. Christ brings me back home. See, pick your metaphor. They're all in the Bible, and they're all naming dimensions of this process of deification. If you want the one term that unites everything, I would say that one, theosis, as the Greek fathers said, deificatio in Aquinas. Or, Paul, someone once said that if you understood the little phrase, en Christo, in Paul's writings, in Christ, you get the whole thing. All the different dimensions of what he meant by en Christo. I'm living now in Christ, see? And I would do it that way. Salvation is being brought into Christ. I'm being Christified, right? Set right, justified, saved, healed, brought back from wandering. That's what salvation is.
Anytime the topic of salvation comes up among Catholics or Protestants, we naturally refer to the words of Jesus and very often the words of St. Paul. But why is the Old Testament important for understanding salvation?
Well, the Old Testament is indispensable for understanding the New. It's a form of Marcionism. That's an old heresy. Marcion in the 2nd century said, let's just get rid of this Old Testament business. And, we just keep certain parts of the New Testament. That's where it's really happening. The church has always resisted that move, and for very good reason. Because the New Testament is the climax to a story, right? If you don't know the first part of the story, the climax doesn't mean that much. You come into a movie at the end and you see, oh yeah, I see what's happening, but I don't know what set this thing up. It means nothing to you. So I won't get the salvation offered in Jesus unless I understand the way Israel wandered. Well, I should put it better. The way humanity wandered from God, and then how God formed a people to draw humanity back to himself. See, that's the story of Israel now. Now look at law, Torah, covenant, prophecy, temple. All the institutions of Israel are the means by which God is trying to draw a people back to himself so that through that people, he might bring the whole world back to himself. Now, where did that whole story come to its climax? In the perfect Israelite, Yeshua from Nazareth, who in his person is faithful Yahweh meeting faithful Israel. And so he is the moment of salvation, if you want. He's the moment of reconciliation. Now, en Christo again, Paul, the good Jew, Rabbi Shaul, says, let's all get drawn into Christ that we might be saved. And now the story of Israel finds its fulfillment. See? Well, we're not going to get any of that if we don't get the story of Israel.
Let's turn our attention now to Jesus and his person. He effected salvation on the cross. Now, help us to understand what's happening there. Why does God use the act of crucifixion in order to effect our salvation?
Yeah, it's the question of questions in many ways, and we can go on for a 3-semester, program to uncover it. Look at a book like Fleming Rutledge's book on the crucifixion, which I like so much. And what she does, I would say, is more of a Catholic instinct. She takes a number of models, if you want, a number of images, ways of getting at it. Let's stay with a couple that I've used. If the problem is that I'm sick, right? Salvation is a healing process. How would the cross be a healing process? Well, God in Christ going into all of our sickness as human beings. Does that involve physical suffering? Yes. Does that involve the fear of death? Yes. Does that involve the alienation of sin? Paul says Christ became sin on the cross, right? Took upon himself the sins of the world. And so the cross is a healing process by which God brings his healing grace to the fullness of human dysfunction. Now look at the play between, for example, Grunewald's in the Eisenheim altarpiece, between the gross depiction of the crucified Jesus and then this transfigured image of the resurrected Christ. Well, see, what is that but a picture of salvation, of healing, of God taking all of our darkness and setting it and healing it. Now take an image like justification, right? That things are off kilter and they've got to be set right. Well, that's deep in the Old Testament mentality. We're off kilter, so something's got to be done. And it's a painful thing that has to be done, namely a sacrifice. And so people would bring an animal to the temple to be sacrificed. What the animal represented was the painful bringing back online of the sin-sick soul, right? What's happening to this animal by right should be happening to me as I'm being painfully brought back online with God. Well, what happens on the cross? It's a rectification, a justification, this great act of sacrifice whereby Christ, like the sacrificial lamb in the temple, takes upon himself the sins of the world. And in that great sacrifice, which is not mollifying an angry deity, that's paganism, that's not the Bible, but it's an act of sacrifice whereby God, on his own initiative, sets things right for us. He justifies us. You know, you could play too with the image of conquest or victory. Salvation's a victory, isn't it? Because we've been conquered by dark powers. Another metaphor we could use. What's sin? What's the problem? We've been conquered by dark powers that oppress us externally and internally. What happens on the cross? But a great warrior goes into the darkness, goes up against the dark powers, conquers them not by worldly force, but rather by the force of the divine mercy. And so now we have the image of Christ the victor, Christus Victor, right? Who's won a victory over sin, death, and the devil. Now, what I'm doing here, again, is typically Catholic move, is take a variety of images. The cross is all of that. See, and one thing I've always resisted, Brandon, is a reductionism that says, well, the cross is this. That's the only way to understand the cross. The cross is understood in a lot of different ways. In fact, here's a cool thing in Catholicism is we're obliged to say, doctrinally, dogmatically, that the cross of Jesus saves us. But there's no theory that we're obliged to hold to. We don't have to, and therefore the way Anselm puts it, that's how we're saved. Anselm says something really important. Or the way St. Athanasius said it, or the way Karl Rahner says it in the 20th century. We're not obligated to a particular theory. And what I like to do, therefore, is to bring a whole range of images. In all these ways, the cross of Jesus is the fulcrum of salvation.
Now, throughout this dialogue so far, you've rarely talked about the individual aspect of salvation, which we hear among a lot of our Protestant friends and family. They often talk about Jesus saved me or the moment I was saved, but you've used a lot of plural language like Jesus saving us or when we were saved. Talk about the difference between those two views.
Yeah, and I wouldn't totally repudiate the individualistic approach. I mean, we do in one sense stand alone before Christ. I wouldn't deny that. There's something right about that. But I'm with de Lubac. Read Henri de Lubac's great book on Catholicism, which is on the social dimension of dogma. Read someone like Balthasar, like Ratzinger. They were deeply influenced by de Lubac's book. And de Lubac is shaped by the church fathers. And their point was all the doctrines of the church have a communal or social form. Including and especially this one of salvation, that we're not saved alone, but we're saved. The human race is saved. My salvation impinges upon yours. I'm not fully saved in a way unless you are too. You know, we're in this together. And I think that's a deeply biblical way to look at it. The Bible is less individualistic. I would agree that with many that would argue that came in more through people like Augustine and then through him up to Luther. But the Bible itself, I think, is much more communal in its way of looking at salvation.
I remember the great Billy Graham rallies. Of course, I don't remember them myself, but reading about them, seeing videos of them, and they would almost always end with an altar call where people were invited to make a personal decision for Christ. And at that moment, you'd commit your life to Christ, and then, in a sense, you'd mark your point of salvation. But in the church, with our sacramental system, we have a sense that grace and salvation is communicated in some way through the sacraments. Can you talk about the role that the sacraments play in salvation?
Go back to John Henry Newman when he was articulating the principles of the Oxford movement. So when he was still an Anglican, but he was advocating a very Catholicizing approach to Anglicanism. And one of the great principles of the Oxford movement for Newman was the sacramental principle, which is, in his language, that visible things become vehicles and channels of invisible grace. And that's a ancient idea. It's emphasized by Catholicism. The sacraments are not just kind of vague symbols that point toward something. They are the embodiments of something. Aquinas will say that the sacraments have both matter and form because we're both body and soul. And so both body and soul have to get addressed. If we were just angels, we're just minds or souls, then the word would be enough. But we're embodied spirits, and so we need both word and matter. And that these sacraments become vehicles themselves of invisible grace. And the church will say it's the privileged way by which God places his life in us. And now, this is very Catholic language, if you want, about salvation. Salvation is receiving again the divine life. What happens through sin, through mortal sin, is a loss of that life. Mortal sin, a sin that kills. It doesn't kill me physically, it kills me spiritually. It takes the divine life away. The sacraments, let's say confession now, restores the divine life. Eucharist feeds the divine life. Confirmation strengthens the divine life. Matrimony and holy orders give vocational direction to the divine life. See how I'm driving it? So we would see these as key. By the way, even though now I was bishop, people don't call me father anymore, but a priest is called father. And why? Well, because a priest is a man of the sacraments. What are the sacraments? The means by which the divine life is given. So the priest is a life giver. That's why we call him father. He, as a biological father, gives life. So the priest gives spiritual life. When I was teaching in the seminary and rector of the seminary, I would often make that connection with the guys. Don't see father as simply some title like doctor, or professor or something. Father names everything you are. It names everything you are. You're a divine life giver, So that's the role the sacraments play.
Now, one final question here. We mentioned at the outset that we're here in the 500th year anniversary of the Reformation. And of course, this question of salvation was pivotal in the disputes between Luther and Calvin and the early Catholic respondents. Maybe we can close here with a brief summary of the points of departure between Catholic and Protestant views of salvation. Maybe you can especially note where Luther sort of differed from the church.
Yeah, and again, you're opening up a huge area here. There's so much nuance. Now, I'll certainly say it inadequately. But I think for Luther, as a figure I deeply admire. I taught Luther for many years and read him carefully. And there's something very moving to me about a lot of Luther's writings. And, what you see in him is someone who was on the rack of this question, if I can put it that way. Deeply bothered by the question, am I saved? The sacramental life of the church wasn't doing it for Luther. I mean, he felt after confession, like within seconds, he felt, I didn't confess something appropriately and I better go back. And he felt God's presence as one of a terrible brooding judge. And so when Luther found those passages, and they're certainly there in Paul especially, to talk about justification as a gift, as a sheer grace, that's not a matter of our works. Luther took that in the way a thirsty person would take in water in the desert. And so he was so impressed by that. And I get it. He should have been impressed by it. I get it. But he tended, and this is now, I'm speaking as a Catholic, to read things too reductively in light of that insight. And people often make the comparison. He's a bit like Descartes. Descartes takes the cogito, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. True? Yeah. Augustine said it, right? Si falo or sum. If I make a mistake, I am, says Augustine when he's dealing with the skeptics of his own time. Augustine knew that, but Augustine never made that foundational for his whole program in the way that Descartes did. And what happened thereby, I would argue, is a certain distortion set in. Well, something similar, I would say, and I say it tentatively, but I'll say it, with Luther, a certain distortion of the whole Christian thing came in because of that reductive reading, that justification is by grace alone, by faith alone, not by works and not by our cooperation. And that alone, the solus, set up a tension that the Catholic Church was unwilling to accept. We thought it was an overstatement that ended up distorting a lot of other things in the picture. I've often said, if Luther had said, gratia prima, grace first, great. And there could be an order of Lutherans in the church today. Is there an order of Dominicans and Franciscans? If he had said simply first, terrific. It was the sola part of it that we thought was too strong. And hence 500 years of dispute,
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. We love hearing from our listeners, including you. And if you have a question, just visit askbishopbarron.com, and there you can record your question on any device. Today we're going to be hearing from Annie from Texas, who asks a relevant question for this episode about how we inherit original sin. So here's Annie's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Annie from Houston, and my question is about original sin. We're taught that we are born with original sin. We're also taught that life begins at conception. I was wondering if you could clarify when exactly we do inherit original sin, and if birth means physical birth, or if there's a different meaning in English that we should understand the word born by. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're raising a lot of things. I'll say one quick thing about it. Think of a child born into a dysfunctional family without any fault of the child. The child hasn't chosen anything, but the child is born into a dysfunctional situation. Whether it's alcohol abuse or sexual abuse or physical, who knows what it is. But the child, without any choice, no blame to be assigned, but the child is born into this dysfunctional family, which means from the beginning, his thinking and feeling and reaction and relationship is going to be distorted. Well, read the Council of Trent now. What will you see is a doctrine, dead right, it seems to me, that the human race is a kind of dysfunctional family, that the history of sin is so pervasive and so powerful that without any blame on the part of a little baby, a baby willy-nilly is born into a dysfunctional family. To use the language you used, he's inherited original sin. And I think that's a good metaphor for understanding what's going on with that. And therefore, just as I wouldn't blame the child, nevertheless, I got to deal with this child's issue if he's born into a dysfunctional family. So I'm not going to blame the baby, but nevertheless, I got to deal with it. The church says we got to deal with it. How do we deal with it? Well, beginning with baptism and then with the sacramental life of the church, we deal with the fact that we're members of a dysfunctional family. Keep the Lubach in mind too there. See, it's not an individual thing, just me and the Lord. It's we and the Lord. I'm in this family that has willy-nilly distorted me, And I think that's why it's important, for example, to baptize babies, because we recognize this as something from the beginning.
I remember that great G.K. Chesterton line that modern theologians dispute original sin, but original sin is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved.
Empirically verified. Just open your eyes and you'll see it. Right.
Well, listen, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Word on Fire show. We're going to be back with you in studio next week for a listener Q&A. That's right, a whole round of questions and answers coming from you. So again, if you have a question for us, visit askbishopbarron.com and we'll choose a handful of them for the episode next week. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.